Once upon a time, there was a small town nestled deep in the woods. It was a place that had a dark history, and the locals whispered about the strange occurrences that happened there. The town was known as Bad Place and was avoided by many travelers who passed through the woods. The residents of Bad Place kept to themselves and rarely ventured out into the world beyond their town. The few outsiders who did venture into Bad Place were often met with suspicion and hostility. There was something off about the town, and nobody could quite put their finger on it. One day, a young couple decided to take a road trip through the woods. They had heard of Bad Place and were curious about the rumors they had heard. As they drove through the winding roads, the scenery around them changed dramatically. The green trees became scarce, and the woods became dark and ominous. As they approached Bad Place, they felt a sense of unease. The town was quiet, and there were no signs of life. They drove down the main street, and the buildings were old and decrepit. The young couple decided to stop at a small diner for some food. The diner was empty, and they were the only customers. The waitress was an old woman who seemed to be staring at them with cold, dead eyes. As they ate their food, they noticed that there were no windows in the diner. The only light came from the flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. They tried to make small talk with the waitress, but she was unresponsive and seemed to be lost in her own thoughts. The young couple finished their food and decided to leave. As they walked outside, they noticed that the town was still eerily quiet. There was no wind, and the trees seemed to be frozen in place. They got back into their car and continued driving through Bad Place. The buildings were dark, and there were no signs of life. The young couple felt a sense of dread wash over them as they realized that something was not right. Suddenly, their car broke down, and they were stranded in Bad Place. They tried to call for help, but there was no signal on their phones. They were alone, in the middle of a dark and ominous town. As they walked through the town, they noticed strange symbols etched into the buildings. The symbols were ancient, and they seemed to be some kind of warning. They tried to ignore them and continue on their way, but the symbols only seemed to get more frequent and ominous. They eventually came across an old mansion, situated on the outskirts of Bad Place. The mansion was old and run down, but it was the only building that seemed to be occupied. The young couple knocked on the door, and an old woman answered. She welcomed them inside and offered them a place to stay for the night. The couple was grateful for the hospitality and decided to stay. As they settled in, they noticed that the old woman had a strange aura about her. She seemed to be hiding something, and the young couple felt uneasy around her. That night, they were awoken by strange noises coming from outside. They looked out the window and saw that the town was alive with activity. The buildings were glowing with a strange energy, and the symbols on the walls seemed to be alive. The young couple was terrified and realized that they were trapped in Bad Place. They tried to leave the mansion, but the old woman stopped them. She told them that they couldn't leave and that they had to stay in Bad Place forever. The young couple tried to fight back, but they were no match for the dark forces that were at work in Bad Place. They were trapped, with no hope of escape. Days turned into weeks, and the young couple lost track of time. They were trapped in the mansion, and were forced to do the bidding of the old woman and the dark forces that controlled Bad Place. They saw things that they could never unsee. They witnessed rituals and sacrifices that were beyond their understanding. They were forced to participate in unspeakable acts that went against everything they believed in. The young couple had become prisoners in their own bodies, their minds warped by the dark energy of Bad Place. They longed to escape, but they knew that there was no way out. One day, they heard a knock on the door. It was a group of outsiders who had stumbled upon Bad Place by accident. The young couple tried to warn them, but it was too late. The outsiders were pulled into the dark web of Bad Place, and the cycle began anew. Years turned into decades, and Bad Place continued to thrive. The town had become a hub for dark energy, drawing in those who were lost or seeking something more. The young couple had long since lost their identities, becoming nothing more than tools for the old woman and the dark forces of Bad Place. They were trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror and despair. Eventually, the couple passed away, their souls forever trapped in the confines of Bad Place. The town continued to thrive, drawing in more lost souls and perpetuating the cycle of darkness. And so, Bad Place remained a dark spot on the map, a place to be avoided by all who knew of its existence. It was a place where the darkness had taken hold, a place where the light of hope could never shine. And it remained that way for many years, a testament to the power of evil in the world.
It was a quiet night in the small town of Millfield. The streets were deserted, and the only sound was the faint hum of streetlights. But as the night wore on, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly and deliberately down the deserted streets. The figure was clad in a long, black coat, and a hood concealed his face in darkness. He moved with an eerie grace, his steps silent as he stalked through the deserted town. No one knew who he was, or what he wanted, but everyone knew to stay away from him. The maniac had a reputation for violence, and no one wanted to be his next victim. The maniac had been terrorizing the town for months, but no one had been able to catch him. The police had mounted patrols, set up checkpoints, and even brought in outside help, but the maniac always seemed to slip through their grasp. He left no clues, no fingerprints, no evidence, nothing that could be used to track him down. The town was on edge, and everyone was living in fear. They locked their doors at night, avoided going out after dark, and whispered about the maniac in hushed tones. But even with all their precautions, no one was safe. The first victim was a young woman, a local teacher who had been walking home from a friend's house late at night. Her body was found the next morning, her throat slashed and her body left in a ditch by the side of the road. The police had no leads, and the town was plunged into a state of panic. The second victim was a local businessman, a well-known figure in the community. His body was found in his office, stabbed repeatedly and left to bleed out on the floor. The maniac had left a message scrawled on the wall in blood, a cryptic message that no one could decipher. The third victim was a teenage girl, a high school student who had been walking home from a party. Her body was found in a park, her face twisted in a look of horror. The maniac had left no clues, no message, nothing to indicate why he had chosen her as his next victim. The town was in chaos, and no one knew what to do. The police were working around the clock, but they seemed no closer to catching the maniac than they had been when the murders had first started. The residents of Millfield were desperate for a solution, but no one knew where to turn. And then, one day, a stranger arrived in town. He was a tall, imposing figure, with a sharp, angular face and piercing blue eyes. He wore a long, black coat, and he moved with a grace that reminded the townspeople of the maniac. But there was something about him, something that set him apart from the other figure that had been terrorizing their town. The stranger walked into the sheriff's office and introduced himself as Detective Alex Finch. He claimed to be an expert in tracking down serial killers, and he offered to help the police catch the maniac. The sheriff was skeptical, but he was willing to try anything. He agreed to let Detective Finch assist with the investigation, and he assigned a team of officers to work with him. For weeks, Detective Finch worked tirelessly, poring over evidence, analyzing crime scenes, and interviewing witnesses. He was methodical, precise, and focused, and he seemed to have a sixth sense when it came to tracking down killers. The town was divided in its opinion of Detective Finch. Some saw him as a hero, a savior who had come to save them from the maniac. Others were suspicious of him, wondering why he had shown up in their town out of the blue. And then, one night, there was a breakthrough. A witness had come forward, claiming to have seen a figure lurking in the shadows near the scene of one of the murders. Detective Finch pored over the witness's statement, and he noticed something that no one else had seen, a small detail that could crack the case wide open. He gathered the police officers, and they went out into the night, scouring the town for any sign of the maniac. They searched alleyways and abandoned buildings, and they checked every dark corner and shadowy nook. And then, in the early hours of the morning, they found him. The maniac was holed up in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, his face twisted in a sneer as he brandished a bloody knife. The police officers drew their weapons, but the maniac was ready for them. He lunged forward, and a violent struggle broke out. The maniac was fast and vicious, and it took all of the officers' combined efforts to subdue him. But finally, after what seemed like hours, they had him in custody. They brought him to the station, and the town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The reign of terror was finally over. The next day, the residents of Millfield woke up to a new reality. The maniac was in jail, and they could finally go about their lives without looking over their shoulders. They went back to work, to school, and to their daily routines, grateful for the peace of mind that had eluded them for so long. But for Detective Finch, the case was far from over. He knew that there was more to the maniac's story, and he was determined to uncover the truth. He spent long hours poring over police reports, studying the maniac's background, and piecing together the puzzle of his life. And finally, after months of investigation, Detective Finch uncovered a shocking truth. The maniac had not acted alone, he had been part of a larger network of criminals, a shadowy organization that operated in secret, preying on innocent victims across the country. Detective Finch worked tirelessly to bring the other members of the organization to justice, and his efforts paid off. One by one, the members of the organization were brought to trial, and they were all convicted of their crimes. And finally, Millfield could breathe a sigh of relief. The maniac was in jail, and the shadowy organization that had haunted their town was gone for good. The residents of Millfield went back to their lives, grateful for the courage and determination of Detective Finch, who had risked everything to keep them safe.
John and Sarah had always been fascinated by the old mansion on the hill. It had been abandoned for years and was rumored to be haunted. They'd heard stories from their friends about the strange noises and ghostly sightings that had been reported over the years. One day, they decided to investigate the house. They drove up the winding road and parked outside the gate. The house looked even more ominous up close, with its peeling paint and broken windows. As they approached the front door, they could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. The door creaked open and they stepped inside. The air was musty and stale, and there was a thick layer of dust covering everything. They started to explore the house, moving from room to room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was old and decayed. As they made their way up the stairs to the second floor, they heard a strange noise coming from one of the rooms. They cautiously approached the door, which was slightly ajar. When they pushed it open, they saw a figure standing in the middle of the room. At first, they thought it was a ghost, but as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they realized it was just an old man. He was dressed in a dusty suit, and his hair was wild and unkempt. He looked at them with a strange intensity and then disappeared through a door at the far end of the room. John and Sarah were both shaken by the encounter, but they were also excited. They had seen something that nobody else had seen, and they knew they had to investigate further. Over the next few days, they returned to the house again and again. They explored every room, searching for clues about the old man and the history of the house. They found a few old newspapers in one of the rooms, which detailed a tragic story about a family who had lived in the house many years ago. The family had been brutally murdered, and the killer was never found. The article mentioned a suspect, a strange old man who had been seen lurking around the property at the time of the murders. The article also mentioned that the old man had disappeared and was never seen again. John and Sarah were intrigued by the story, and they continued their investigation. They started to notice strange things happening in the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and they heard strange whispering voices in the halls. They started to feel like they were being watched, and they started to become increasingly paranoid. One night, they decided to stay in the house overnight. They set up a makeshift camp in one of the bedrooms and settled in for the night. At first, nothing happened, but as the night wore on, they started to hear strange noises coming from the other side of the room. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the old man stood there, staring at them with his piercing eyes. He looked angry and agitated, and his hair was wild and unkempt. John and Sarah screamed in terror and backed away from the old man. The old man started to move toward them, and they could feel a cold chill spreading through the room. They tried to escape, but the old man was too quick. He cornered them in the room, and they could see his eyes glowing in the dark. Suddenly, the old man disappeared, and they were alone in the room again. They looked around, and they realized that they were standing in a pool of blood. They had been transported back in time, to the night of the murders. They were trapped in the house, and they knew they had to find a way out. Once upon a time, there was a world that existed beyond the reach of normal internet. This world was known as the Dark Net, and it was a place where people could access things that were forbidden or illegal in the regular internet. At first, the Dark Net was used by hackers and criminals to exchange information and goods. But as time passed, the Dark Net grew to encompass a much wider range of activities. People would go to the Dark Net to buy drugs, weapons, and even people. It was a place where the darkest desires of humanity could be fulfilled with no consequences. One man, named Jack, stumbled upon the Dark Net by accident. He was a curious individual, and he was always looking for new experiences. One day, he stumbled upon a website that promised him access to the darkest corners of the Dark Net. At first, Jack was hesitant. He had heard stories of the Dark Net and knew that it was a dangerous place. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to explore the dark corners of the Dark Net. What he found there was beyond his wildest dreams. He saw things that he had never seen before, and he was exposed to a world of depravity and darkness that he never knew existed. Jack quickly became addicted to the Dark Net. He spent hours every day exploring the dark corners, looking for new experiences and pleasures. He began to buy drugs and other illegal items, and he quickly found himself in over his head. But Jack couldn't stop. The Dark Net had become his escape, his way of coping with the world around him. He knew that he was in danger, but he couldn't help himself. One day, Jack stumbled upon a website that promised him something different. It was a website that claimed to offer access to a secret society that existed beyond the Dark Net. The society was said to be made up of the most powerful and influential people in the world. Jack was intrigued. He had always been fascinated by secret societies and the power they wielded. He decided to explore the website and see what he could find. What he found was a series of tests that he had to pass to gain access to the secret society. The tests were difficult and dangerous, but Jack was determined to succeed. He passed the tests and was given access to the secret society. At first, he was thrilled. He had finally achieved something that he had always dreamed of. But as time passed, Jack began to realize that the secret society was not what he had expected. It was a place of darkness and evil, where people would do anything to gain power and control. Jack found himself caught up in a web of deceit and danger. He was forced to do things that he never thought he was capable of, all in the name of the secret society. He tried to leave, but the society had become his life. He was trapped, with no way out. As time passed, Jack began to realize that the secret society was not just a group of individuals seeking power. It was something much darker and more sinister. He discovered that the society was involved in human trafficking and was using the dark net to sell people to the highest bidder. They were also involved in illegal weapons sales and were planning a terrorist attack on a major city. Jack knew that he had to do something to stop them. He reached out to the authorities and told them everything he knew about the secret society. The authorities were skeptical at first, but they soon realized that Jack was telling the truth. They raided the secret society's headquarters and arrested everyone involved. Jack was hailed as a hero, but he knew that he had lost something along the way. The dark net had consumed him, and he had been a pawn in a game that he could never win. He vowed to never return to the dark net again. But even as he tried to move on from the horrors of the secret society, he found that the dark net was always lurking in the shadows, tempting him with its forbidden knowledge and experiences. He began to have nightmares about the dark net, dreams of being pulled back into its depths and consumed by its darkness. One night, he woke up to find that his computer had been turned on, and the dark net was open on his screen. He tried to turn it off, but it was as if something was controlling his movements. As he watched in horror, his computer began to download files and open websites that he had never seen before. He tried to disconnect his computer from the internet, but it was too late. Suddenly, his screen was filled with a message that read, "You can never escape the dark net. You belong to us now." Jack knew that he was in deep trouble. The dark net had taken control of his computer and was now threatening him with unknown consequences. He tried to call for help, but his phone was dead. He was alone and trapped, with no way out. As he sat there, staring at his computer screen in horror, he heard a strange noise coming from outside his apartment. It was a low, guttural sound, like something was trying to break through the door. Jack knew that he had to act fast. He grabbed a baseball bat and stood in front of the door, ready to defend himself. But as the noise grew louder, he realized that he was no match for whatever was on the other side of the door. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a group of hooded figures rushed in. They were carrying strange symbols and chanting in a language that Jack didn't recognize. Jack swung his baseball bat, but it was no use. The figures overpowered him, and he was dragged out of his apartment and into the dark, empty streets. As he looked around, he realized that he was in the heart of the dark net, surrounded by strange symbols and shadows that seemed to move on their own. The hooded figures began to chant louder, and Jack felt himself being pulled towards a strange, glowing portal that seemed to be opening up in front of him. He tried to fight back, but it was no use. The figures were too strong, and he was dragged through the portal and into a world of darkness. As he looked around, he realized that he was no longer in the world he knew. He was in a place of darkness and evil, a place where the rules of reality did not apply. And he knew that he was never coming back. He was trapped in the dark net, a victim of his own curiosity and the darkness that lurked within it.